London, March 1973. Kensington Palace Gardens. Every morning, the same black cab waited outside the Soviet embassy. Same driver, same smile, same joke about London weather. For nearly 2 years, no one questioned him. Not the diplomats, not the guards, not the KGB officers climbing into his back seat. His name was Charlie Hodges, or so they thought. But Charlie wasn't just driving through London. He was mapping it. Every stop, every whisper, every conversation they believed was private. And by the time one Soviet officer realized the truth, the trap had already closed around him. This is Operation Friendly Fare. Thomas Barrett was born in Croydon in 1938, the son of a railway clerk who changed accents depending on which supervisor walked past. Barrett inherited this unconscious mimicry. By age 12, he could shift between 3 London dialects mid-sentence without thinking. Teachers called it disrespectful. Military recruiters, years later, called it useful. His skill wasn't languages. It was social invisibility. Barrett could enter a room and leave behind nothing but comfort. People forgot his face, but remembered feeling at ease. Associates described him as attentive, never intrusive. He asked fewer questions than anyone expected and remembered more answers than seemed possible. Before MI6, Barrett served in military logistics between 1956 and 1959. His superiors noticed something unusual during routine transport duties. Drivers talked to him, not because he interrogated them, but because he listened without judgment. He remembered their children's names, their complaints about rations, their preferences for routes. When a security review flagged potential insider threats in the motor pool, Barrett had already identified 3 of them simply by paying attention to what people said when they thought no one important was listening. This ability, making people feel unobserved while observing everything, moved him into intelligence work in 1961. By the late 1960s, MI6 faced a problem it couldn't crack through conventional means. Soviet diplomats in London operated freely under legal cover. Embassy staff enjoyed full immunity. Surveillance teams were burned within weeks. Safe houses were compromised. The Soviet embassy on Kensington Palace Gardens functioned as an operational fortress wrapped in international law. Traditional methods, phone taps, mail intercepts, photographic surveillance, produced minimal actionable intelligence because Soviet personnel understood they were operating in hostile territory and maintained strict operational security. The frustration reached critical levels in 1969 when MI6 identified increased KGB activity across London but couldn't determine the purpose. Personnel moved frequently. Meetings occurred in public spaces. Dead drops were serviced quickly. The tempo suggested something significant, but every attempt to develop sources or place technical surveillance failed against diplomatic immunity and professional counterintelligence discipline. British intelligence doctrine during this period emphasized long-term human penetration over technical collection when diplomatic immunity blocked traditional surveillance. The underlying principle was patient and brutal. If you couldn't watch them directly from outside, you embedded yourself into their routines. You became part of the landscape they stopped noticing. The approach chosen for London's Soviet problem was radical for its patience. No bugs planted in walls, no break-ins to install cameras, no tail teams burning through personnel. Instead, MI6 would own the movement layer, how targets got from place to place. London's black cab system offered perfect cover. The taxis were regulated, respected, and invisible. Nobody questioned why the same driver appeared repeatedly at the same location. Repetition created familiarity. Familiarity created trust. The obstacles were severe. First, placement. Access to the Soviet embassy taxi stand required local legitimacy. A new driver appearing suddenly would raise questions. Second, duration. Months of exposure increased the risk of compromise exponentially. Every ride was an opportunity for the asset to make a mistake. Third, control. The asset would operate alone, with no visible handlers, no backup teams, no emergency protocols unless compromised beyond recovery. The isolation was operationally necessary, but psychologically brutal. The trigger came in late 1970 when MI6 identified a mid-level KGB officer conducting unexplained weekly excursions across London. His diplomatic cover listed him as a cultural attaché. His actual role was suspected to involve operational support, logistics, communications, or servicing dead drops. His name was Yuri Volkov. Surveillance teams followed him 3 times. He spotted them twice. After the third attempt, Volkov altered his movement patterns entirely. MI6 planners concluded that conventional surveillance would never penetrate Volkov's activities. But Volkov still needed transportation. Within 6 weeks, planning moved to execution. The operation was designated Lantern Key. The asset selected was Thomas Barrett. The cover identity would be Charlie Hodges, a cheerful London cabbie with no history, no politics, and no reason for anyone to remember him beyond his punctuality. During the planning phase in early 1971, Barrett experienced what operational psychologists call compartment integration. The process of becoming Charlie Hodges required more than memorizing a backstory. It required internalizing a completely different personality framework. Charlie was gregarious, where Barrett was reserved. Charlie told stories. Charlie had opinions about football teams Barrett didn't follow. Charlie had a fictional ex-wife and 2 children he mentioned casually in conversation. In the pre-deployment assessment, Barrett told his handler he found the process disturbing, not because the deception was difficult, but because it was becoming easy. The handler's notes from that session, declassified in 1998, record Barrett's concern. "I'm not pretending to be Charlie anymore. I'm remembering being him." The assessment concluded Barrett remained operationally viable, but flagged the comment for post-operation psychological review. The mission continued. By March 1971, all elements were in position. Barrett had completed his transformation into Charlie Hodges. The vehicle was prepared. The communication protocols were established. But first, one critical element needed resolution. Barrett needed to become a fixture at the Soviet embassy taxi stand without anyone remembering how or when he'd started appearing there. Within 3 weeks, that problem would solve itself through nothing more sophisticated than showing up every morning at the same time with the same smile. Barrett's cover identity, Charlie Hodges, was built over 6 months using a process MI6 called deep integration. He didn't just learn about backstory, he lived it. He completed official black cab training through the Public Carriage Office, the same program every legitimate London taxi driver completed. He memorized the knowledge, 320 routes covering 25,000 streets within a 6-mile radius of Charing Cross. He passed the written examination and practical assessment under his alias. Transport for London issued Charlie Hodges a valid Hackney carriage license in March 1971. The documentation was authentic because it was real. MI6 hadn't forged credentials. They'd created a genuine taxi driver who happened to be an intelligence officer. Barrett's cab was a standard Austin FX4, black, diesel, indistinguishable from thousands of others operating across London. The modifications were minimal and passive. Operation code Lantern Key specified no active surveillance devices that could be detected through routine sweeps. Instead, the vehicle was fitted with a modified meter assembly containing a miniaturized microphone with a Pickup radius of approximately 2 meters, enough to capture backseat conversations clearly without requiring directional positioning. The audio fed into a concealed short-range transmitter with a 400-meter burst radius. The transmitter activated only when the meter was running, blending its signal profile with the meter's normal electrical operation. The technical specifications were deliberately conservative. Maximum recording duration per ride was 45 minutes before automatic tape loop overwrite. No storage, no retrieval. Transmission occurred in real time to a mobile receiver unit operated by a separate surveillance team that never made contact with Barrett directly. If the cab was searched, the most sophisticated inspection would find a slightly unusual meter assembly that could plausibly be explained as a repair shop modification. Operational structure was deliberately thin. Barrett reported only once every 2 weeks via a dead drop system labeled post box, even. A hollow utility marker in Holland Park disguised as a standard telecom access point. He deposited handwritten notes coded using a simple substitution cipher that took 15 seconds to encode and could be destroyed by tearing the paper into pieces small enough to flush. No handler contact, no check-in calls, no emergency extraction plan unless compromised beyond doubt. The isolation was designed to protect both Barrett and the operation. If he was caught, he couldn't compromise his handlers because he didn't know who they were. By April 1971, Charlie Hodges was assigned to the informal taxi queue outside the Soviet embassy on Kensington Palace Gardens, an unremarkable detail in a city built on routines. London cabbies had unofficial territories, preferred stands, regular clients. Charlie's territory became the diplomatic quarter. His timing became predictable. Every morning, between 0700 and 0900 hours, he appeared at the embassy stand. He waited. He read the newspaper. He made small talk with other drivers about traffic and weather. Within 3 weeks, Soviet staff began favoring him for his punctuality and silence. Embassy personnel appreciated drivers who didn't ask questions about destinations or attempt conversation beyond basic pleasantries. Charlie Hodges was exactly that driver. Polite, efficient, forgettable. First contact with Yuri Volkov occurred on May 18, 1971, at 1940 hours. Volkov emerged from the embassy's side entrance and approached the taxi stand where Barrett was waiting. He requested a drive to a West End theater, the Prince of Wales on Coventry Street. Barrett did not ask which show. He did not comment on the route. He drove. 12 minutes into the journey, Barrett mentioned, unprompted but plausible, a pub near the theater that served decent food. Volkov thanked him but said nothing else. The ride lasted 23 minutes. Volkov paid exact fare plus a modest tip. Barrett recorded the destination, timing, and Volkov's demeanor in his next dead drop report. Subject fee, theater, cautious, evaluating. Complications surfaced early. Volkov spoke fluent English with a barely detectable accent. During their third ride together in June 1971, Volkov tested Charlie with an obscure cultural reference, a comment about a music hall comedian popular in the 1950s. Barrett responded appropriately because Charlie Hodges had been constructed as someone who would remember such things. But the exchange wasn't casual conversation. It was reconnaissance. Volkov was checking whether his driver was who he claimed to be. On July 9, 1971, Volkov abruptly changed destinations mid-ride. They were heading toward Hampstead when Volkov suddenly requested a route to Bloomsbury instead. Barrett changed course without hesitation or surprise. But while making the turn, he watched Volkov in the rearview mirror. Volkov was watching the side mirror, tracking whether any vehicle adjusted course to follow them. It was a textbook surveillance detection maneuver. Barrett's report that week noted, Subject V conducting active counter-surveillance, operational awareness high. The execution window began to open when Volkov made the mistake Barrett had been waiting for. He began talking, not about work, not about Moscow, about loneliness, about British weather, about how London felt simultaneously crowded and isolating. Then he mentioned names, then places. Over the summer of 1971, Volkov took 11 rides with Charlie. The conversations lengthened. Volkov complained about diplomatic functions he was required to attend. He mentioned colleagues by first name. He referenced frustrations with embassy bureaucracy. None of it was classified information. All of it was intelligence. Every name Volkov mentioned was cross-referenced. Every location he visited was mapped. Every complaint about embassy politics revealed internal relationships and hierarchies. By August 1971, MI6 had developed a detailed pattern analysis of Volkov's movements. Tuesdays, Westminster, usually government buildings. Thursdays, Soho, meetings in cafes. Fridays, Bloomsbury, library visits. The regularity suggested Volkov was servicing a network, either running agents or maintaining dead drops. The critical tradecraft decision came in September. MI6 could have arrested Volkov's contacts based on the surveillance intelligence Charlie was providing. But arrest would burn the source. Instead, planners authorized Barrett to deepen the relationship. The objective shifted from passive collection to active recruitment. October 3, 1971. At 21:30 hours, during a drive along Bayswater Road, Volkov mentioned he was tired. Barrett, as Charlie, asked if he'd been working long hours. Volkov said yes. Barrett said he understood. His fictional brother worked in shipping and complained about the same thing. Volkov asked what kind of shipping. Barrett said he didn't really know the details, just that his brother traveled a lot and seemed exhausted. The exchange lasted 90 seconds. It was the first time Charlie had volunteered personal information without being asked. It established reciprocity. Volkov began sharing more. By December 1971, Volkov was using Charlie almost exclusively for his weekly excursions. He requested specific pickup times. He greeted Charlie by name. During a ride on December 17th, he mentioned he would be traveling over the holidays and wouldn't need a cab for 3 weeks. He said this apologetically, as though inconveniencing a friend. Barrett's handler report from that period noted a concerning development. The report stated, asset experiencing psychological boundary erosion. Recommend monitoring for legend drift. Legend drift was the operational term for when a cover identity began displacing the officer's actual personality. The warning was filed but not acted upon. The operation was producing results. January through June 1972 followed the same pattern. Volkov continued his weekly routines. Charlie continued driving him. The conversations deepened into something resembling friendship. Volkov talked about his childhood in Leningrad, about his father, who'd been a factory supervisor, about missing Russian winters. Charlie reciprocated with details from his constructed past, his fictional marriage, his fictional children, his very real knowledge of London streets. During this period, MI6 identified 17 individuals Volkov met regularly. Surveillance confirmed 12 were intelligence assets providing information on British defense research, parliamentary politics, and labor union activities. But surveillance alone couldn't determine what information was being passed or how it was transmitted. The decision was made to move to the next phase. July 1972. Barrett received new instructions via Postbox 7. The directive authorized progression to recruitment approach. The method leveraged intimacy, The timeline, no more than 90 days. The execution began with calibrated pressure. On August 2, 1972, during a ride to Piccadilly, Charlie mentioned casually that he'd seen Volkov getting into another cab the previous week. It was a lie. But Volkov's reaction, brief tension, quick explanation about scheduling conflicts, confirmed he understood the implication. Charlie knew his patterns. Charlie was paying attention. 2 weeks later, Charlie mentioned he'd been driving for nearly 2 years around the embassy and had started recognizing regular passengers. He said this while driving Volkov to a meeting in Chelsea. Volkov asked if Charlie remembered many faces. Charlie said some, yes, especially the ones who were friendly. The subtext was clear. I see more than you think I see. September 14, 1972. During a drive along Cromwell Road, Volkov asked Charlie directly if he ever wondered what his passengers did for work. Charlie said no, people's business was their business. Volkov seemed relieved. But then Charlie added that he figured most diplomatic folks had complicated jobs he wouldn't understand anyway. The word diplomatic hung in the air for 3 seconds before Volkov changed the subject. The pressure was psychological, not operational. Barrett was demonstrating awareness without making threats. He was showing Volkov that the comfortable routine they'd built existed only because Charlie allowed it to exist. October through February 1973 involved systematic escalation. Charlie began referencing details only someone tracking Volkov's movements would know. The name of a cafe Volkov visited regularly. The fact that Volkov always requested the same table. Small observations that could be coincidence, but accumulated into pattern recognition. Volkov's responses shifted. He became more guarded. He asked fewer personal questions. He watched Charlie more carefully, but he continued requesting rides. The psychological trap was fully constructed. Volkov suspected Charlie might be surveillance, but confirming that suspicion would require confrontation. Confrontation would end the relationship. Ending the relationship would cost Volkov the one genuinely comfortable interaction he had in London. So he continued riding, and Charlie continued watching. March 3, 1973. At 21:12 hours, during a drive along Bayswater Road, Barrett executed the operation's final phase. They were 10 minutes into the ride when Charlie mentioned the weather had been unusually cold. Volkov agreed. Charlie said it reminded him of stories his fictional uncle used to tell about winters in northern England. Then Charlie said something in Russian, a single phrase, a hometown idiom specific to Leningrad's working-class districts in the 1940s, the exact neighborhood and era of Volkov's actual childhood. The phrase referenced ice on window panes and children's games. It was not something taught in language courses. It was not something diplomats used. It was something only someone from that specific place and time would recognize. Silence followed. 43 seconds, according to Barrett's later report. Volkov understood instantly. Exposure was total. Charlie Hodges didn't exist. The friendly driver who remembered preferences and told jokes about London weather had never existed. Every conversation, every shared confidence, every moment of comfort over nearly 2 years had been surveillance. Barrett, still maintaining Charlie's voice, offered no threats. He simply stated facts. He said he knew who Volkov was. He knew what Volkov did. He knew the people Volkov met. Then he said Volkov had a choice. He could continue his work, knowing that every detail was now visible, or he could cooperate and perhaps make the situation less complicated for everyone involved. He phrased cooperation as a professional courtesy between two people doing difficult jobs. The drive continued for another 8 minutes without conversation. Volkov exited the cab at his destination, a restaurant in Kensington. He paid the fare. He did not tip. He looked at Barrett for approximately 5 seconds before walking away. That night, Barrett reported the interaction via Postbox 7. The message was 4 words. Contact established. Subject evaluating. 72 hours later, Volkov requested another ride. He provided an address in North London. When Barrett arrived to pick him up, Volkov got into the cab and immediately asked to drive somewhere quiet. Barrett drove to a residential area near Regent's Park and stopped. Volkov asked what Barrett wanted. Barrett, no longer maintaining the Charlie persona fully, said he wanted information. Volkov asked what would happen if he refused. Barrett said that was Volkov's choice. But the surveillance wouldn't stop. And eventually Moscow would notice someone was paying too much attention to Volkov's activities. Volkov asked if Barrett was threatening to expose him to his own service. Barrett said no. He said the situation would expose itself. He was simply offering to make it manageable. Volkov chose to talk. The cooperation was never formal. Volkov didn't defect. He didn't sign agreements. He simply began providing information during their rides. He identified which embassy personnel were intelligence officers. He described the structure of KGB operations in London. He confirmed the purpose of his weekly meetings. He was servicing a network of British citizens providing industrial and political intelligence. Over the next 3 months, Volkov provided details that allowed MI6 to dismantle the entire support network without making arrests that would reveal the source. Assets were quietly neutralized through other means. Some were fed disinformation. Others were transferred to positions where they no longer had access to sensitive information. The network collapsed without anyone understanding why. Barrett continued driving Volkov until June 1973. Their interactions remained professional but cold. The friendship, the fabricated friendship, was never mentioned again. On June 14, 1973, Volkov was reassigned to Moscow. Officially, it was routine diplomatic rotation. Privately, MI6 assessed that Soviet intelligence had no idea their officer had been compromised. Volkov had been too careful. Barrett had been too controlled. The operation had left no visible evidence. Barrett received orders to extract from his cover in July 1973. Charlie Hodges returned his taxi to the fleet, citing health reasons. The license was allowed to lapse. The identity was dissolved. Thomas Barrett exited operational service in August 1973 without ceremony. His handler conducted a final psychological assessment. The report, declassified in 2001, noted that Barrett described the moment of revealing his true purpose to Volkov as ending a friendship that was never real. When asked if he felt the operation was justified, Barrett said he understood its necessity, but questioned whether understanding made it ethical. The Poltsa psychological review concluded Barrett remained stable, but recommended against future long-term undercover assignments. He was reassigned to analytical work and retired from MI6 in 1981. By March 1974, Soviet intelligence completed a routine review of Volkov's London activities. Nothing in the official record suggested compromise. His reassignment was noted as standard rotation. The network he'd been servicing had collapsed, but the failures were attributed to operational errors by the British assets themselves, not to exposure by their handler. MI6's assessment was more precise. The operation had dismantled an entire intelligence network without a single arrest, without exposing sources and methods, and without creating diplomatic incidents. 17 British citizens who had been providing information to Soviet intelligence were neutralized through reassignments, retirements, or subtle career disruptions that appeared unrelated to espionage. The network ceased to exist, while Soviet intelligence wasted months trying to rebuild it using the same compromised methodology. Intelligence gained from Volkov's cooperation included detailed knowledge of KGB recruitment tactics, communication protocols, and assessment criteria for potential British assets. Secondary benefits included identification of gaps in British security clearance procedures that Soviet intelligence had been exploiting. The information reshaped MI6 counterintelligence operations throughout the 1970s. The cost was primarily human rather than operational. Volkov returned to Moscow, carrying the knowledge that everything he'd trusted in London had been manufactured. Associates who knew him before and after the assignment noted personality changes. He became withdrawn, less willing to engage socially, professionally functional, but emotionally distant. He served in administrative positions until retirement in 1984. For Thomas Barrett, the consequences were psychological rather than professional. Colleagues who worked with him in analytical roles during the late 1970s described him as competent but detached. He rarely discussed operational work. During a training lecture in 1979, he told new intelligence officers that the hardest part of undercover work wasn't maintaining the lie. It was recognizing when you'd succeeded so completely that another person's trust became a weapon you'd built yourself. The calculation from MI6 perspective was straightforward. The benefits: dismantling an active espionage network, preventing continued intelligence losses, gaining insight into Soviet methods, outweighed the costs. Whether this proved correct depends on how you value trust, deception, and the human price of strategic necessity. The operation reshaped British human doctrine in lasting ways. It demonstrated that routine access could outperform invasive surveillance when targets operated under diplomatic immunity. It proved that patience and psychological methodology could achieve outcomes traditional espionage techniques couldn't. Most significantly, it established that the most effective cover wasn't a disguise. It was a life convincingly lived over sufficient time that the target stopped questioning its authenticity. Operation Lantern Key was cited in classified training materials throughout the 1980s as the model for long-term infiltration operations. The technique, embedding an officer into the routine infrastructure of a target's daily life, was replicated in various forms across multiple theaters. The success rate was high. The psychological cost to the officers involved was also high. By 1989, operational psychologists recommended mandatory assessment protocols for any assignment exceeding 6 months in cover identity. The moral question remains unresolved. Was Thomas Barrett's operation brilliant intelligence work that prevented genuine harm to British national security? Or was it emotional entrapment that weaponized human connection against someone whose primary vulnerability was loneliness in a foreign city? From MI6's perspective, Barrett prevented continued espionage without violence, without public exposure, and without creating international incidents. He targeted a professional intelligence officer engaged in active operations against British interests. The relationship was tactical from the beginning. Volkov's cooperation was voluntary. He chose information over exposure. From Volkov's perspective, the one genuine human connection he'd built during years of isolation in London was revealed as systematic manipulation. Every conversation, every moment of comfort, every instance of feeling understood had been surveillance. The psychological impact of that revelation, the understanding that intimacy itself had been the operation, was arguably more devastating than any formal interrogation. The question becomes whether engineered trust is fundamentally different from authentic trust, and whether that difference matters when the engineering is perfect. If a Volkov experienced the friendship as real during those 22 months, does the fact that Barrett was performing make the experience less valid? Or does the revelation of performance retroactively transform every prior moment into violation? Intelligence services argue that operational necessity justifies tactical deception against legitimate targets. Critics argue that weaponizing human connection crosses ethical boundaries that strategic objectives cannot justify. Both positions have merit. Both ignore the complexity. The reality is that Operation Lantern Key exists in the space between these absolutes. It was neither purely justified nor purely condemnable. It was effective intelligence work that achieved its objectives through methods that would be considered psychologically manipulative in any other context. Whether effectiveness justifies methodology is a question every intelligence service, every government, and every individual must answer based on their own assessment of where the boundaries of acceptable action lie. What remains inarguable is the human cost. Two men spent nearly 2 years building something that resembled friendship. One knew it was performance. The other discovered it had been surveillance. Both were changed by the experience in ways that persisted long after the operation concluded. Thomas Barrett spent the final years of his career analyzing intelligence from a desk, never again assuming an identity that required sustained human deception. Yuri Volkov spent the final years of his career in administrative functions, never again trusting foreign interactions enough to let them become personal. If trust can be engineered with sufficient skill and patience, does that make it any less real to the person experiencing it? And if the answer is yes, if engineered trust is fundamentally different from authentic trust, does that make its weaponization more justifiable or more unforgivable? The answer reveals more about your worldview than about the operation itself. What's your take? Was Barrett's 2-year performance justified intelligence work? Or was it psychological manipulation that crossed ethical boundaries regardless of strategic necessity? Drop your perspective in the comments. If this story made you reconsider where the boundaries of acceptable intelligence work lie, hit that like button and share this with someone who'll argue the opposite position. The conversation matters more than the conclusion.